Have you ever heard of the musical, The Puppetmaster's Regime? Most likely you haven't. In fact, most die-hard theater lovers are often unfamiliar with this little production. It was a 1934 stage musical written by anonymous authors of the music, lyrics, and book. It starred upcoming performers such as Timmy Cutie Pie Wright, Sally Wilkes, Henry Gregory, as well as many others. At the time, it was the most expensive show to date. It was said to be the biggest, most spectacular stage show to San Francisco and back. From the Testament of Tyler Warwick, 1901 to 1983. The cast was made completely of new people, young children and adults alike who were longing to get back on the stage after vaudeville became old news. It was quite charming, really, but I did take a bit of notice to that odd little playbill. All the playwrights and lyricists and everyone were all unnamed, and that design, it was a little red drop with a peculiar little face in it. Not even a title, just a little red dot. I'd come to New York with my parents on an impromptu vacation after my grandmother had died. A Broadway musical seemed just like what we needed. From the Testament of Carl Hannigan, 1920 to 1993. I do recall most of the first act. Then again, who could forget? The story was a little hard to follow at first. There's a little boy who lived in a puppet shop. Or maybe he lived down the street. No, wait. No, he worked in the puppet shop, but he was homeless, so they provided him with a home there. The kid's name was, Mortem? Something weird. No, wait, that's right, it was Mortimum. No, wait, Mortimer. Mortimer, yes, that's right. Anyways, Mortimer's employer was this old man named Mr. Absizer. I remember his name because his character was unimaginably unsettling, bouncing all around and getting angry at the little boy, all while keeping this nasal, gigglish voice. Anyhow, the production opened to Mortimer and the odd fellow getting into an argument over the boy not doing his work. Then the two of them sang this peculiar number about puppets. It wasn't a normal song, or at least the musicality wasn't normal. Lyrics were very enchanting, and the music did this odd flowing thing about the room. Instruments would get very quiet without losing any power to it. Maybe it was just the acoustics. I'm most likely explaining it all wrong. Oh well. But in time we got used to it, and the show progressed. From the Testament of Gabriel Johnston, 1919 to 1976. This youngster, Mortimer, something like that, was quite insecure about his stay in the puppet shop, very paranoid that his boss would throw him out. I was an aspiring lyricist at the time, and I'd done the lyrics to a few original community theater projects, so I was fascinated with the wording in these songs. I scribbled down a few lyrics after I'd went home. Unless I'm remembering wrong, little puppet shop boy and Mr. Obi something had an introductory duet, and then Mortimer went off and had a short lament in a different, much more somber tune. If I stay and do everything right, I can live in the day, and stay clear of the night. Out there in the night, in the dark, there's a world of whys, maybe lies. I can hear them whisper, and sometimes I can see their eyes. The eyes comment confused me for a moment, but then I assumed that he was meaning the stars. It seemed as though the number was unnecessarily tragic and poorly situated within the show, but it was a minor quibble. Now, Mortimer had two friends, a girl named Trawhunt and a boy named Adelbit. After interrupting the final note in his lament, they all gushed about how much they loved puppets. But they just couldn't afford one from Mortimer's guardian's shop. And so they transitioned into this vibrant little song about joining forces to raise money so they could afford to build their own puppet. After this, the three all headed for school, and the story took a sharp turn in a different direction. Now, they had this really nasty teacher, or headmistress, named Madame Rapiro, or something like that. They had a reprise of the song from before, and she overheard them. And at first, her remarks about the children's fantasies were somewhat comical. But then the light fixed on her, and she sang this heartbreaking song. What the song was about was up for interpretation. It was somewhat about love, but it had all these strange puppet metaphors. The only lyric that stayed with me is, "Stroll through the wood, cracks, show them your pains, the hole in your throat, and the strings in your veins." Then she just went on this breakdown. I assume it was a poorly conceived character trait. She started singing off-key and went to beat one of the kids. The curtain fell, and there was a scuffle heard on stage. People whispered to each other, but a rising new orchestra piece silenced us. The curtains rose again, and we were right outside the puppet shop. From the Testament of Lewis Roberts, 1905 to 1967. Mortimer and his friends went into the town and sang a song about selling dolls, I think it was, because the little girl made dolls in her spare time, and she had to sell them. I remember those strange background characters. The company was so absolutely monotonous. They all wore some form of dark clothing, and each of them were very, very tall. I can remember how they all had their faces covered up by hair or hats or veils. None of them spoke. None of them even sang during the course of the show. They just walked in perfectly straight lines, as if they weren't even part of the production. Anyways, this strange song about buying dolls, it had absolutely no life. But for some reason, these children were putting their all into it. I could see the pain in their faces as they hit those high notes. There was something else. As the lyrics went on, they seemed to get a little... It's hard to explain, really. They all looked like they were maybe hurting a little. They looked so pale and nervous all of a sudden. Coming from a stage family, I convinced myself it was only stage fright, but it still made me just a tiny bit anxious. From the Testament of Carrie Laurie, 1921 to 1995. The kids all got their money from this strange man in a cloak, who sang a simple little tune. I still remember the lyrics. Despite the fall of rain, little kitties, everyone needs a little song. Wooden dolls give you pain, little kitties. Go on, little kitties, run along. This character was never really explained, but I remember how truly gripping the melody was. So haunting, got you right in the gut. Even little kid actors seemed a bit unsettled by the new turn of the show. They all kept stuttering over their lines as they spoke and sang. And the light bulb over the stage went out. Everyone kinda gasped, and one man I think even laughed. The noise it made really spooked the little girl. Little Miss... what's her name? All the names were very strange. All I know is that that light bulb had gone out, and the actors were stumbling across the stage. The whole thing looked like a terrible flop. When the children re-entered the puppet shop, they presented Mr. Obsizer with the puppet pieces they'd acquired when the audience wasn't looking, singing a braggedy sort of chant. We done, diddly diddly done did it. It was obnoxious, but thankfully brief. After that, the light fixed on Mortimer, and he began another tune. The song was a dud, and all I remember was that he flubbed the last line. The lyric had something to do with the final stroke of light, or some sort of long-winded moon-based metaphor. All I know is that he forgot the words, and all that could be heard in the theater was the sound of car horns outside the building. The boy, he didn't seem shocked or embarrassed or anything, but his posture improved out of the blue, and the orchestra stopped. He projected half of the word sorry, and suddenly he burst forth in wordless vocalization. The music resumed. The other characters began to join him. From the Testament of Marcus Edger, 1918 to 1968. So after that bulb went out, the whole set started falling apart. We, the audience, tried our best to ignore it, but it was damn near impossible. I saw 2 sets of very angry attendees get up and leave. Set piece for the puppet shop screeched its way onto the stage, and we could see in the far back the paper sky background falling apart. Lights went dim in what we assumed was an attempt to hide the malfunctioning set pieces. The kids, with the help of an oddly monotonous Mr. Upsizer, constructed the puppet, and this strange song played. To this day, I don't know what they were saying. It sounded vaguely like Latin, but I went on to study Latin in college the next year, and I found that guess of mine to come out flat. I do remember how it enchanted me, though. It enchanted all of us. We all began to feel this thing course through us. I remember a few people around us who were humming in an attempt to rid themselves of the sound. I could hear people in the front rows crying out in what sounded like pain. The actors themselves sounded as though they were about to pass out at any moment. They were doing this sort of ballet, and they were tripping all over themselves. And a few more lights started flashing and breaking. We all sat and waited for the song to end. That's when... Sorry. From the Testament of George Frank, 1899 to 1999. The lights were going on and off at random, and we were all praying the damn song would end soon. It had this force going with it. It was sucking us in. We could feel it. Little kids and the puppet man were dancing all around when... Well, you see... God, I really thought I could do it. I was right there in the 5th row, so I saw it. I just can't. From the Testament of Carolyn Mark, 1901 to 1949. Lighting was completely out of control. It was a mess. And that song, it was awful. Something about it. It was powerful. It had a force. I watched intently as the dancers began to skip around and I thought they were the lights. Conclusion. The actual events of the final scene of Act 1 of the Puppetmaster's regime has been up for debate for many years. Not many people are willing to speak out about what happened on stage during those final moments. Many believe that there is no actual record of an interview with somebody who is willing to tell the story. This is not true, as one testament survives from a Billy Prescott, who was only 6 at the time of the show. At such a young age, one might assume he was less affected by what he recalls happening. I was just a kid, so I don't remember much. All I can vaguely recall is that song. It was giving me a headache. I turned to my dad and asked him if we could leave, when suddenly I saw the stage illuminate with this bright red light. Music stopped as one instrument after another died out. I swear I heard pounding underneath the stage. Everyone was questioning what was happening, even the actors. I remember that teacher lady being pushed through the door of the shop, then everyone else came flying in from off stage, toppling on top of each other like rag dolls. There were people who didn't fit the design scheme of the production. Stagehands and technical workers, I assume now. I remember the little girl screamed at the audience, then ran behind the shopkeeper while other actors continued singing. A few people started crying right there on the stage, and suddenly this curtain came forward. It's hard to describe what it looked like. It was like clear plastic wall. It came down from above. Several years later, I saw Carrie the Musical on Broadway during one of its few runs. That thing that came down on the prom goers when Carrie was using her laser lights to kill everyone. It was just like that. A bunch of set pieces from earlier scenes came down on the sides of the stage, trapping all the actors in the center. Then chaos erupted. The actors stopped singing and were pounding on the plastic wall. Then, for some reason, they began to back away, as if some unseen assailants were coming towards them. They fled to the back of the stage, all except the little boy who hadn't stopped singing. Then, amid all that screaming and crying and shooting, the curtain flew out, and everything was silence. Due to that odd abruptness, the audience thought it was just a horrible ending to a terrible musical. We were about to get up when suddenly the curtain opened up again, revealing the stationary plastic wall, upon which a single light fixed on a little boy, Mortimer. He had clawed his way through the plastic wall. We could see the blood on his hands, but the way he looked was... There were strings attached to every part of his body. We could all see his stomach, or lack of. It was like somebody had put a huge ice cream scooper in his belly. He was sobbing all over the stage, twitching and swinging around. It was a sight so unnatural looking, so painful and twisted and wrong. Even now, I can't seem to wrap my head around how. Everyone looked at him, not knowing what to do. And then he spoke. "Help me. Please, help me." That was all I could make out. And then he vomited and suddenly collapsed. Plastic wall lifted. The lights all came on, and we saw the rest of them. They were all dead. Every one of them looked exactly like the little boy. Everyone had those strings attached. And we watched as all of them, even the little boy, as their strings were pulled on, their lifeless bodies rose on cue, and they bowed. We cannot be certain that this is a credible account, but unfortunately, it's all we have to work with. The Puppetmaster's regime sparked horrible debates among the theater companies. Several audience members had to be treated to special therapy for years to come, and the show itself was covered up by the police. For some time, the theater company, as well as the police department, who had never managed to solve the gruesome murders of the cast and crew of the show, denied that the play ever existed. However, in recent years, the story has resurfaced, sparking much new debate on the subject. The theater that housed the musical still refuses to acknowledge the show's existence, and most theater historians know nothing about the show in general. To this day, the identities of the anonymous lyric and music writers are unknown. And, to our knowledge, all recordings of the songs and police reports have been destroyed. However, through certain pieces of historical documentation, we can gather a bit of information on the production. The show itself had its first workshop in London in 1928. One of the songs, Get a Puppet, was recorded with vocals by 12-year-old Garris Creeley. However, this recording has been lost, but is supposedly available in the black market of the internet. Other than that, no official records were ever made. Some ancient accounts say that an illegal audio taping of the final scene of Act 1 was recorded from backstage, but we cannot be certain that this is anything but a rumor. As for any official memorabilia, very little of anything has survived. Until her death in 1994, theatrical historian Gladys Masters kept 2 large-scale posters, which she displayed at charity events, but these have since disappeared. Early costumes by Alice Lively, who had been the costume designer on Puppetmaster until she quit after payment disputes, are on display at the Piccadilly Theatrical Museum in Dover, England. Other than that, playbills from its premiere night were given out, but most audience members destroyed their copies after seeing the show. Legend has it, around 10 to 20 survive. On another note, over the years, the show has grown a small cult fan base. And here, recently, an off-Broadway revival has been scheduled to premiere soon. When I had originally approached this topic, I believed that all of the audience members who entered the theater on that fateful night were deceased, but I was incorrect. One lone audience member, Alice Corley James, who was 9 years old when her grandparents took her to see the show, lives in Connecticut with her grandchildren. I gathered this information after my long investigation as to the theater which housed the unfortunate events of 1934. I found myself on a wild goose chase after a long line of theater owners shoved me in different directions via emails or the rare private meeting. I was eventually given the home address of an old man who shall go unnamed. This man had worked in several theaters over the past 50 or so years and had collected many borrowed theater items. One of these items was a box labeled 34-Creeley/Wright. The gentleman claimed that he found it in the vaults of the August Wilson Theater, but I'm not sure if he can be trusted, as his eggs seem to be in quite a few baskets, if you understand me. The oddly numbered box contained several sloppily organized papers, all of which detailed the long-awaited production of the Puppetmaster's regime. The most interesting of these files was a bulky folder that detailed the 1928 workshop in London, where the title of the show was originally Mortimer's Friends, which was later changed to Mortimer's Puppet. As music was refined, however, the title became The Puppet Dressed in Black, and was finally changed to Puppetmaster, which was the title they used during the actual staged readings. The folder also contained a partial script for the show. Although many pages appeared to be missing, none of the song lyrics were shown on the script, although the song titles were printed in their place, along with notes for the young actor playing the part of Mortimer. Most of the notes are from the director, a man named Richard Webber, but one particular note seems a bit ominous. A little less vibrato on this one, Garris. Make me proud. Make us both proud. Mr. Sheridan. This Mr. Sheridan never showed up on any of the other files. He may have been an unaccredited assistant director. but something about his handwriting just didn't sit right with me. Anyways, some of the song titles are rather fascinating. Tunes with such titles as Never Mind Me, Mister, Mortimer Was an Orphan, and Get a Puppet. They make the production seem like any other. The characters don't seem to be written in any strange way, much to my disappointment. It seems like a harmless little kiddie show, cutesy and upbeat. However, as the script progresses, the notes from this Mr. Sheridan become more evident, and his messages become increasingly disturbing. We love it the way you used to do it. Stop doing what we never told you to try. Your cheeks puff at the end of this number, Garrus. I love it. He loves it. We both love it. They love it. Meet me backstage after the reading, Garrus. He has a gift for you. Meet us backstage again, Garrus. They love to look at you. Never leave us, Garrus. You're too important to Puppetmaster. After reading up to the scene where Mortimer and his friends try to sell dolls, creatively titled The Doll Selling Song, I decided to stop reading and do a bit of research on Garrus Creeley. And I was not prepared for the results. Garrus Creeley was born on November 3rd, 1916. His mother had been a vaudeville stripteaser who lacked the funds necessary to support a child. As a result, he was taken in as a 3-year-old by a man whose last name was Sheridan. His first name is recorded differently in many documents. Most believe it to be either Carmichael or Charles. Sheridan was apparently a Coney Island architect who designed elaborate funhouses and carnival freak houses. He was also a private composer, having written many vaudeville numbers and Coney Island themes. Garrus Creeley Sheridan was a semi-popular vaudeville performer from 1921 to 1923, upon which he was removed from the Sheridan home after Garrus claimed to have been sexually assaulted by his adoptive father. Garrus was taken to live with Annabelle and Henry McGregor, a middle-class family living in Upper Manhattan. Annabelle and Henry, in an attempt to rid him of his childhood trauma, relocated to Worcester, England, with Henry McGregor's relatives. Coincidentally, Puppetmaster began rehearsals for the workshop a year after Garrus Creeley moved to England. The music and lyrics were still accredited with Anonymous. Now, one might assume that this is just another depressing backstory to a child performer from the early 1900s. But no, it gets worse. Sheridan, along with being an architect and composer, was also a great patron of child pornography. He was the leader of a small group of individuals who specialized in the production of such articles. What makes this more revolting is that from 1921 to 1923, the years that Creeley was his legal son, Sheridan housed a child-centered burlesque theater/brothel underneath his estate. In 1924, he was placed in the Danvers State Lunatic Asylum in Massachusetts and escaped in 1926, a year before rehearsals began for Puppetmaster. Now, returning to the script for Puppetmaster, we actually have a tangible record for both the end of Act 1 as well as most of Act 2. The actual ending for Act 1, as it was written, was such. Mortimer and his friends design a puppet exactly like the one that Mortimer has seen in his dreams. This was explained in a song entitled The Puppet Dressed in Black, which I assume was cut in the Broadway production. This puppet then comes to life and calls upon his magical powers to send Mortimer and his friends into a parallel universe. Act 2 begins with Mortimer finding his friends, as well as Mr. Absizer, to be asleep and dangling from puppet strings. The musical takes a more operatic theme. We have 6 songs that are played one after the other, without a single interval of speech. The song titles begin, "Never Mind Me, Mr." Reprise, "I Can Hear Them Sing." "What Is This Place?" Mortimer Soliloquy, "Wooden Dolls," and "The Wind and the Whisperings." After this, Mortimer is confronted by the odd man in black from the first act, who, in a long monologue, explains Mortimer's deep, passionate sexual longings. Mortimer realizes his clandestine emotions in a song entitled "Beautiful Music," in which the man and Mortimer apparently fall spontaneously in love. And right before they allude to the thought of intercourse, the puppet dressed in black appears, jealous of Mortimer's affections. Mortimer strips naked in front of the puppet, allowing for the wooden demon to seduce him. Mortimer offers his soul in return for the puppet, releasing the ones closest to him. When the children in Mr. Absizer are returned, the puppet dressed in black and the old man reveal their sole motivations: to punish little children who repress the nature of their sexual responsibilities. They explain this in what would eventually become the show's title song, "The Puppetmaster's Regime." Then, in a spout of randomness, the puppet's face turns bright red, and he shoves Mortimer into a bed shaped like a hand, apparently raping him. In the epilogue, we see that Mortimer's friends have all been returned to the puppet shop, but none of them remember anything about him. As you would assume, the workshop didn't do well at all. Anybody with half a brain would understand why a musical about why children are obligated to have sex with adults and puppets wouldn't work now, let alone in 1928. It was met with such a terrible response that the authorities forced the workshop to shut down, classifying it as child sex tourism. Garrus Creeley was temporarily removed from the McGregor household for their approval for allowing him to participate in the production, when in reality the cast members were contractually obligated to never speak about the show to anyone outside the production. A week after Garrus returned to the McGregors, he was kidnapped from his bedroom. This all happened the day before his birthday. After 2 days, the authorities found Garrus at the theater that had been holding the workshops. He was found in the basement of the theater, tied to a bed, being violently raped by Sheridan. Sheridan, of course, was taken into police custody, where he died 2 days later of a lung infection. However, the most disturbing part about the crime scene was described by Officer James Cartwright. "We broke through the door, and we were all fumbling down the stairs. We could hear him, Creeley, screaming. We charged into the basement and saw puppets. Puppets everywhere. All of them were made to look exactly like that Creeley kid. There had to be dozens of them all over the room. Some of them were neatly dressed, like little dolls. Others didn't have any clothes on at all. God, it was disgusting. I feel sick just thinking about it." Along with a recorded 76 Garrus Creeley-esque puppets that were found underneath the theater, authorities also found several articles of the occult in Sheridan's makeshift apartment. He had apparently begun to worship an ancient god he called Podominus, a dark spirit who controlled all life with invisible puppet strings. Most of the investigators believe that Sheridan had created this god himself, using the surplus of insanity he had retained by the time of his death. They also found a 5,023-page novel that Sheridan had written over the course of the past 9 years, entitled Puppets. It was an extended manuscript version of Puppetmaster that was centered around the character of Mortimer Abernsees, a character obviously based on Garrus Creeley. Following the events of Puppetmaster, the McGregors admitted Garrus Creeley to the West Riding Mental Hospital, now known as the High Roids Hospital, in order to repair his obvious mental damages. He was supervised by his adoptive uncle, Dr. Gregory McGregor, who personally documented his progression from 1928 to 1932, when he was released. Other than the folder containing information for the 1928 workshop, most of the documents present in Box 34-Creeley/Wright are mass jumbles of different documentations. Everything from vague police reports to scathing reviews of the workshop, and none of them are in any particular order. The only valuable document I've managed to find is a list containing the names of all the audience members who attended the 1934 Broadway premiere. Seeing as how Alice Corley James is still alive and was seated in the fourth row of the theater, I hope to contact her soon in order to continue my investigation. From the personal diary of Annabelle McGregor, January 7th, 1932. Garrus came home today. He seemed paler than he used to, much more quiet. I wish there was something I could do. I wish I could bring him back to us. But he's gone. I have to accept that. We all have to. As it turns out, the diary of Annabelle McGregor was used in the writing of a 1998 psychological thesis by Catherine Jacobs entitled From Garrus to Hannah, a study as to the effects of child molestation. In this book, the author uses materials from various different child molestation trials to form an in-depth study on the resulting mental scars such experiences can produce in children. Annabelle's entries themselves aren't that relevant, often repeating the same things over and over, but they do form a cohesive thread between two big events in Garrus Creeley's life: his release from the West Riding Mental Hospital and his journey back to America. According to Annabelle McGregor, 19-year-old Garrus Creeley left his parents a week after returning to them, going off to work in a shoe factory. After being fired for inability to follow proper safety instruction, he worked as an assistant ballet instructor in London. 6 weeks after this, he returned to his parents, where he heard that they had been harboring a secret from him. After Sheridan, his previous adoptive father, had died, Garrus was left to inherit all of his belongings. This included the expansive novel, Puppets, and the script and score for Puppetmaster, the musical version of the same novel. From the diary of Annabelle McGregor, September 18th, 1932. Garrus called to tell us he was leaving. We asked when he was coming home. He hung up after that. It's been 4 days, and I'm beginning to believe that I won't ever see him again. Not much is known about Garrus Creeley after that. The next existing record of him is in a financial statement in 1933 concerning an inquiry for a choreographer for the Puppetmaster's regime. It would appear that Garrus was continuing his adoptive father's work. Why on earth Garrus Creeley would drop everything in his life to continue the work of his childhood rapist is beyond all logical comprehension. One reason could be that he wanted to understand his father more. He was, after all, Sheridan's son. Perhaps he understood how much Puppetmaster meant to him and had devoted himself to polishing up the production. In Catherine Jacobs' book, she details a great many examples of this. In the letter from Garrus to the aforementioned choreographer, he writes, I hope to enliven the production with a bit of playful mystery, such as the essence of the original novel format. I don't have the complete manuscript for Puppets, though Catherine Jacobs apparently does own a small snippet of about 200 pages. God only knows how she acquired this. She lists a total of 17 excerpts in her book. From what I've read, the prose of Puppets is very difficult to comprehend. One might assume that Sheridan had never stopped writing it, and had never revised. The story itself follows the main character, Mortimer Abinses, as he goes off on an adventure to explore his own sexual agenda upon the request of a puppet that he meets in a dream. To get a feel for the odd, flowery nature of the writing, here's a snippet. The puppet was as black as night upon the cold winter eves of Lammastide, light and airy, yet weak and bitterly sharp. Upon sensing the figure's wooden presence, he scattered himself about the room, unable to find a proper door or window to relieve his urge to escape the angry monstrosity. His eyes danced along the riverway of contempt, stealing glances of the form that beckoned for him to remain motionless. Defeated, he rested himself within his own terror, bending as he slipped into his remorse and fear. I have nothing to work on but the vague points provided by Miss Jacobs for this assumption, but I gather that Garris used his inheritance to fund the production of the Puppetmaster's regime. In the box 34-Creeley/Wright, I found a small folder full of production notes from Garris that I had glossed over in my previous search. Nothing of great importance stands out, other than the pitch Creeley used to gain attraction of several theater owners who were interested in housing the production. In this, Garris describes the show as upbeat, fraught with flowery production numbers, and a moral all ages can relate to. I feel like this is a good time to bring up my meeting with Miss Alice Corley James. I made sure to phone her grandchildren for permission to visit, for which I was declined 3 times. After I sent the cake, however, they understood my persistence, and I was granted access. It was a 6-hour drive to the home of Alice Corley James. Her granddaughter was hospitable enough. Well, as hospitable as someone can be when they obviously don't want you in their house. She took me to the living room and offered me some cake, which I declined. A few minutes later, I met Alice, who limped her way onto the couch with a plate of cake in her hand. I tried speaking with her, but she refused to talk to me until she had finished eating. I took an instant liking to the old bat, nutty as she was. Throughout the following Q&A, Alice made it very apparent that she had reviewed her facts. They seemed rehearsed and tired coming from her lips, but I didn't think much of it. From the Testament of Alice Corley James, 1926 to present. Question: how old were you when you saw the Puppetmaster's regime? Answer: 9. I had just turned 9 that Wednesday, and we were going to have a party the following Saturday. Question: what do you remember about the production? Answer: I truly don't remember a lot about the show. I was young, I was hyperactive, and I was bored. Bored to tears by the entire thing. It was so very monotonous, and so blandly staged. I recall watching the 3 kids dancing the exact same motion, twist tap, for almost 4 minutes, all while the ensemble walked in crisp lines. It was so awkward. That little boy playing the main character, Maury something or other, was a bit quiet if you ask me. He sort of mumble-spoke, squinting the entire show. Those vague, squinty eyes were bland too. I fell asleep halfway through Act 1. Question: do you remember the end to Act 1? Answer: no. When I woke up, my parents were dragging me out of the theater. I spent the next 3 hours waiting by the street with my mother while my father searched for his brother. Uncle Devin was the assistant choreographer. He died backstage. I think a lift collapsed. I'm not sure. It was only when I was 30 did they actually tell me what happened, though I remember that they never acted the same again. Question: did your uncle keep any documentation of his time working on the production? Answer: I wouldn't know. We weren't all that close to him, you see. Question: if he did, where could I find those documents? Answer: either they're still at the theater, or my father. Now that I think of it, my father probably had them. I remember the policeman delivering the box to us. Your best chance of finding it would be in the attic. We moved all my father's old office documents into a red chest. If it isn't there, it is most likely thrown away. Mrs. James's granddaughter aided me in my search, and together we found the red chest, as well as Devin Corley's belongings. They had been shoved into a small storage crate within the chest, sloppily strewn in wrinkled chunks of paper. I offered Alice the opportunity to rifle through the crate, but she politely shooed me out of her house before asking for another piece of cake. At first, I couldn't make much sense of the contents within the box. There are a few bills, some blasé production notes, and a list of ensemble performers. However, one particular sheet of paper did catch my interest. The audition notes for the role of Mortimer. For those of you who don't remember, this was the character whose actor was seen begging the audience to help him on the night of Puppetmaster's premiere. Not many names are found in this file, oddly enough. Just 14 boys and 6 girls. Underneath the various names are notes over the auditions. Notes such as too cheeky, too quiet, too mumble-mouthed. But about 3/4 into the paper, the name, Timmy Wright, is circled 3 times, a small star etched beside it. He's the one, the note reads boldly. I've done a bit of research on this performer as well. Timothy Cartwright was born on August 16th, 1923. His father, Vincent Cartwright, was a lighting designer for a theater on Broadway at the same time. His wife, Margie, was a costume designer, though little is known about the beginning of Timothy's career. But by the age of 9, he had taken the vaudeville world by storm as Timmy Cutie Pie Wright, or Cutie Wright for short. As far as I can gather, his only Broadway credit before the Puppetmaster's regime was in a semi-successful flop called Joyful Hooligans, in which he played a young British boy who falls off a ship and is taken in by a band of American teenage pickpockets. Devin Corley's diary details the arrival of Timmy to the theater. He says that Timmy was asked to be dropped off in the lobby without his parents. Garris Creeley instructed the staff not to enter the lobby for an hour. At the end of this hour, Garris Creeley himself came through the lobby doors and found Timmy still in his seat by the receptionist desk. He was quoted to have looked confused and scared, with a look in his eyes that likened to an old cat, weak and defenseless. Garris led him back to his office, where he waited for his parents to return to sign the paperwork. The next few entries of Devin Corley's diary describe the hiring of the rest of the cast and crew. Shirley Taxum was signed on to play Trahant for 3 weeks, died in an automobile accident, and was replaced by Sally Wilkes. Henry Gregory, another vaudeville performer, who who had worked with Timmy at least twice before, was signed on to play Adelbit. Other cast members include Fernando Perrin as Mr. Absizer and Grace Day as Madame Rapiro. The casting for the Man in Black, as well as the puppet dressed in black, are not listed. Set design was done by Abraham Duarte, and costumes were done by Juliana White. Lighting and direction was taken up by Garris Creeley himself. For the first 2 weeks of production, Devin Corley's description of Creeley doesn't seem too interesting. A bit eccentric and a bit of a perfectionist, but he also is described as jolly and surreal, like the Santa impersonators you see at the department stores. He was always cracking jokes and, for the most part, had a good attitude. However, as innocent as his behavior seems, even from the beginning, he has a strange obsession with Timothy Wright. Corley details an instance where Timmy was clearly getting the choreography wrong, and yet Garris berates the other children for messing him up. From Devin Corley's perspective, he coddles the boy and barely even directs him. Now, as lighthearted as he was, Garris Creeley was also a rather strict director. Devin Corley claims that each of the cast members was to arrive at 4 a.m, 2 hours before crew arrived, simply for vocal exercises and warm-ups. One entry states, the ensemble was placed into 3 lines, and the children were lined up in front. Mr. Creeley would spend 15 minutes going over the exact same tap routine each morning. He always had Timmy do it first, then the others were to follow. Afterwards, everyone was to gather in a circle for vocal warm-ups. It would start by going through their ranges, then Garris had us do that awful dance. There were to be 2 circles, one inside the other, and the cast would hold hands. Then, both circles were to dance around in opposite directions. The outer circle began the chant first, crying out, "Seaman tell, seaman tell," while the inner circle yelled out, "Freyla, Freyla." Both chants were ensemble lyrics that had been cut from the production, but Mr. Creeley saw it fit to include them every morning, saying they were perfect vocal exercises. Garris's impatience continues throughout the rehearsals. He grows violent, and many cast members report to Devin that Sally Wilkes exhibited bruises on her upper arms. The script was modified weekly, putting the company in great stress. Timmy Wright was the one who took most of the damage, as most of the changes gave his character more lines, placing him under a lot of pressure. He was often asked to visit Creeley's office for private readings, where he'd stay for hours. Tragedy entered the life of Timothy Cartwright on August 13th, 1933, when he and his family had been the victims of an automobile accident which killed his father and severely injured both he and his mother. Devin writes that for a month and a half, Garris visited Timmy daily and eventually stopped coming to rehearsals altogether. The principal choreographer, Mandis Thorman, took up the role of director during that time. It was also during this time that they sought out the employment of 14-year-old Rory Atkins to be the understudy for Timmy. Devin writes that it was at the conspiring of Thorman and the producers that Rory would eventually replace Timmy. "This cutie Wright," writes one producer, "is completely inept in the art of performance. His delivery is too big, his eyes are too big, his presence is too big. And for all that bigness, he has a shocking little amount of talent and discipline. Mr. Creeley spoils the boy and hardly gives a scrap of motivational honesty in the direction of anyone else. In short, Timothy Cartwright must go." While Garris was gone, the production staff also persisted in cutting certain things from the show. This included a number that occurred midway through Act 2, a gibberish number sang by an army of puppets that they said slowed down the production. Creeley was quite unhappy with this, giving them several angry phone calls about the matter. They eventually gave him an ultimatum. Cut the number completely, or put it somewhere else. Garrus placed it at the end of Act 1. Devon notes that Garrus would tell the children to practice this number on their own time, and when they did run through it during rehearsals, it was in segments, never in its entirety. The number itself contained one group of lyrics that was repeated over and over. Garrus made it painfully clear that the company was to sing these stanzas exactly 100 times before they could take up a break during intermission, even if the curtains closed before they were finished. Devon's journal ends with a relief from the notes throughout. Instead, he explains an event that he himself was present for. I think it's best to simply copy the section itself. Nobody was ever allowed in Mr. Creeley's office but Mr. Creeley and Timmy. I assume Mr. Creeley would want to meet Rory, but he never asked for an audience with him. However, Mandus had instructed me to deliver 3 resignation letters to Mr. Creeley's desk, and I went to my task. When I came in, the room was all musty and hot, like there wasn't even air conditioning there. The windows were drawn, but my vision adapted fairly quickly. I saw that on the floor was a worn mattress with plates and cups all around. I blinked in surprise. Rushing over to the bedding, I saw that it had definitely been in use for quite a while. I wondered, in astonishment, if Mr. Creeley had been living in the theater. When I considered the idea, I did recall that he had put all his money into this show, and we never heard him ask us to send papers to his house, only to his office. Along the far end of the room were a few piles of shirts and trousers. It was still very dark, so I didn't focus on them too much. I went to set the papers down on the desk when, against my better judgment, I had the urge to snoop around a bit. I looked over the top of the desk, nothing but pens and scrambled folders, then went right to the center drawer. What was inside the drawer frightens me more now than it did when I saw them. Within the drawer was a gun. A bit eccentric maybe, but I thought nothing of it. As well as a worn, hand-painted mask, red in color. It was put into the shape of a doll's face. A puppet's. Beside the mask was a small journal. I opened it. I found the pages to be yellowed with age. The pages themselves concealed mad writings that were barely legible, but I could tell by the drawings that it was some sort of worshipper's guide. There were these charcoal sketches of a puppet, a giant puppet that controlled the world on strings protruding from its fingernails. Other pictures showed the puppet walking amongst common men who could not see it. There was a drawing of a man raping a small girl, the puppet controlling his arms. There was a man stroking the bodies of his wife and children, a young girl being bought for the night by an older gentleman, 2 twins being held down on their bed by some invisible force. All pictures in which the puppet stood by, grinning. I placed the journal back into the drawer, but when I noticed the mask had the same face that the puppet had. An insane grin, wide eyes, puffy cheeks. It was only when I held it closer to my face did I notice it also shared the features of Timmy. The same mouth, the same nose, same eyes. I shoved the mask back into the drawer and shut it, my curiosity morphing into sickness. I backed away from the desk and hit the wall, turning to my right. I felt my foot come into contact with the pile of clothes I saw earlier. My eyes had completely adjusted to the dark by now. and I could see that not all of the shirts and trousers were in Mr. Creeley's size. At least 4 of them were smaller. The clothes a young boy would wear. I grabbed the papers off the desk and ran out. I delivered them into Mr. Creeley's hand that afternoon. After that, there are 7 blank pages in the journal of Devin Corley. There are no more entries. At the bottom of this crate, however, was a newspaper dated October 3rd, 1935. The headline reads, "Flower Shop Vandal Strikes Again." And on the 3rd page is a small section dedicated to the disaster that occurred at the August Wilson Theater on October 1st. Oddly enough, the article doesn't mention the Puppetmaster's regime by name more than once, but it focuses on the aftermath. In an interview with police officer Jeremy Winthrop, "We don't have any idea what could have happened. We got a call from the diner down the street, talking about some riot going on down at the August Wilson. We came to find a bunch of theater goers crying and begging for help. They just kept saying, 'They're dead, they're dead, they're really dead.' We went inside. We didn't find anything." You see, 76 attendants of that 1935 showing went missing. 98 if you count the theater company, whose bodies were never recovered from the stage. Though many testified to have seen them die, others claimed to have seen people collapsing in the aisles. When police investigated the theater, they saw that one of the lifts backstage had collapsed, but there were no traces of anyone there. The only body recovered was that of Garris Creeley. He had been found in his office, a bullet in his head. Other than that, nothing. No blood, no struggles. And those 98 people were never seen again. After that, there's nothing left in the crate but barely visible photos of cast members and fabric samples for costumes. At this point, my investigation for the Puppetmaster's regime ended, or at least the historical investigation. Do you remember the revival of Puppetmaster I mentioned? Well, the first preview performance will take place in Chicago on September 18th. I've already booked balcony seats. Being a full-time investigator for an obscure pornographic musical doesn't lend itself to much of an earning, you see. I will be attending this showing, where I will record the audio and take notes on the production. I'll do a detailed run-through of the production the day after I see it. Investigation will resume September 18th. Update. September 20th. I arrived in Chicago last week, where I stayed with a couple of old high school friends for a few days. We had fun catching up, but I never took my mind off the Puppetmaster's regime. The theater that housed the production was rather obscure, located a few miles out of the main city. None of the news articles I read post-preview have mentioned the name of the theater, so I can only imagine they don't want the publicity. Upon entering the theater, I was given a playbill by a cheery man in a suit, an older gentleman with a weak smile on his face. The playbill itself showed the white silhouette of a young boy, several puppet strings attached to a scribbly red and black heart that hung within his chest. There were white dolls hanging around him. I remember thinking it was odd that a preview playbill would be in color, as those aren't usually printed until the show starts making money. Anyways, I made it to my seat and began to read through the playbill. I didn't care much about the names of the cast members, though I do recall seeing the picture for the boy playing the part of Mortimer, a 14-year-old named Milton Holliday. The show opened to a long, plodding overture, played mostly with piano, with these odd whistles being played through the speakers all around the theater. After about 5 minutes, the music changed to a more bouncy, lighthearted tune, and the curtain came up. The stage was empty, nothing but the projected backdrop of a village square, with these odd clouds floating above. About 10 children in 18th century German clothing skipped on stage, playing with balloons and dolls. As the music progressed, a small mechanical horse wheeled itself on stage. The lights dimmed, and the children stopped. The horse dragged along a cart, upon which a small curtain puppet box faced the audience. As the cart came to a stop, a large puppet in black robe flew out from behind the curtain. The children screamed and backed away. Then the puppet spoke. "Good day, little ones. What a wondrous day for a bout of play, isn't it? Now don't you be frightened, sweetlings. The puppet dressed in black has a tale to weave, and someone has to hear it. Why, even if a story isn't terribly uplifting, it's the relevance of the story that matters, isn't it? Now gather my popinjays, for this story, I'm afraid, requires the keen ears of a curious child. For only the innocent can see things simply, without the distractions of growth." The children looked at each other and slowly began to gather around the cart. Once they were all seated, the puppet let out a chilling laugh. "That's the spirit, kiddies," he spoke. "Now this is a story about many things, about love and hate, about dark and light, about the difference between right and wrong, and the difference between wrong and right. But at the core, this is a story about a little boy named Mortimer." And with that, light on the cart fades away, and a light fades in on a small boy holding a broom, smiling proudly. Mortimer. The rest of the prologue is rather bland, and I can't remember or decipher the audio to much of the exposition. The puppet, Mortimer, and Mr. Absizer share a song. We learn that Mortimer was an orphan who Mr. Absizer found on the side of the street 5 years ago, and has since put him to work in his puppet shop. The costumes from this point seem much less historically accurate from the opening scene. Everyone's costumes seem faded and bland in color scheme, but each of the outfits are ridiculously frilly and layered. Some of the story's exposition has changed. For example, Mortimer's last name, Abinses, has been reapplied from the novel on which the story was based. The staging and set design is oddly reminiscent of Andrew Lloyd Webber's The Woman in White. Most of the sets are made up of hyper-realistic projections that give the illusions of a moving camera. However, unlike The Woman in White, there are far more set pieces which actually have moving images projected onto them, like the revival of Sunday in the Park with George. For example, during one of the opening songs, I can hear them whisper. We see Mortimer sweep up around the puppet shop. We watch as the front desk and 2 puppet display shelves spin around on the turntable as the projected background spins slightly faster, adding in ominous shadows and subtle lighting changes. It was dizzying, but effective. Most of Act 1's exposition seemed rather harmless in my opinion. It almost seems like the start of a Disney show. However, I did find my inner critic rolling his eyes at some of the puerile lyrics. My personal favorite being, "He pretended he was crying, though they told me he was lying," and "He was a sickly boy, knowing not of joy." However, upon comparing the new version to what I've heard about the other 2, there are some significant changes to the show. For example, the character of Madame Reparo has been cut completely. After the cutesy song, "Get a Puppet," we are taken to the center of the village. Here we have one of the songs that had been cut in previous versions, entitled Widowline, in which the villagers celebrate a holiday of the same name. This celebration focuses on villagers dancing around with puppets and dolls made out of random objects such as twigs, scraps of clothing, and cornstalks. The music is charming, like a folk song, although the lyrics don't seem to make much sense. Dancing as we pither through the withering and woe, evermore lined along with the ever-growing row, eyes without a trace of tones or livelihood, and so rise and rejoice for a Whittleline song, and the willows will wander all Whittleline long. Here, the song where the children sell dolls is used as a bridge in the Whittleline sequence. Another change is the rearranging of The Mind and the Whisperings, a song that was originally played in Act 2. In this new version, it's sung monotonously by a group of black-clad people mourning the loss of a young girl, a rape victim. The sequence itself is strange. Around 8 people walk on stage, 4 of them carrying a small coffin. Lighting goes from yellow-orange to blue, and the chorus drones on for about 8 minutes as they somewhat explain how this girl died. The wind was her muse for play, and she pranced along the riverway. She slipped along the side of the weeping willow's hair, and she danced along the riverway with nary a remorse. The whisperings from far away, calling out for her to stay. She stayed there with the wind and the whisperings of yore, and she danced with him until he saw fit to take her source. Again, this uncomfortable ensemble song goes on for about 8 minutes. From what I could assume, the little girl had been playing along a river when a man asked her to stay with him until nighttime, where he raped her and tried to drown her before a policeman stopped him right as the girl had perished. Other than that, most of Act 1 seem the same as the other versions, given there's a small bit where a girl with a puppet mysteriously appears and disappears while Mortimer sweeps up the shop, and a random scene right before the final in which Mr. Upsizer sings about the hardships of raising Mortimer, a song reworked from the same song Madame Rapiro sang in 1934. The finale's song itself, which so many people had claimed held some sort of force to it in the 1934 production, didn't seem all that powerful, though this may be due to a rewrite. The 1934 version was said to be significantly longer than the 1928 workshop. At around 12 minutes of non-stop gibberish lyrics, this version has a reprise of The Wind and the Whisperings, followed by a few verses told through the odd language. Lyrics are, in fact, somewhat odd-sounding after 2 minutes of non-stop strobe lighting, but I wasn't that affected by it. There weren't any deaths after the finale, though intermission did last 10 minutes more than it was supposed to due to technical difficulties backstage. Act 2 was where most of the changes seemed to be. It began with a light on Mortimer being strung up on ropes like a puppet, his friends and Mr. Upsizer hanging on either side of him. A new song plays where all the songs from Act 1 are placed into a montage, while the Act 1 finale music plays in the background. Just as the music shifts to the pounding, Whittleline music, Mortimer awakens. Remember when I mentioned that Act 2 was mostly made up of a bunch of songs played one after the other for no apparent reason? Most of that has been cut. The only 2 songs from that long, drawn-out sequence are What Is This Place and Mortimer's Soliloquy, which has been renamed to Mortimer Confronts the Puppet and has been changed to a duet sequence. The lyrics have been improved as well, whereas the 1934 show had lyrics such as this: What is this place? What are you aiming? This isn't well, sir. Why are we gaming? This isn't a game. The improved lyrics are, What is this place? Wait, am I dreaming? This isn't real, no, nor what it's seeming. It's all a dream. Still a bit clunky, but at least they make sense now. The particular scenes I listed before involve a panicking Mortimer confronting the puppet dressed in black, who explains that Mortimer's soul once belonged to a child rapist, and that he died before the puppet could punish him. This is where the set designs became a bit odd. There were several floor-to-ceiling metal dollies that would constantly roll about on stage, as if to symbolize Mortimer walking somewhere. The backdrop went red. There were projections of puppets flinging the corpses of children along the walls. To say it was unsettling would be an understatement. After this, the story progresses in a similar manner as the 1928 workshop, but with different twists. Mortimer learns that the odd-looking man in black from the first act was the boy that Mortimer raped in a past life. The man in black wants to revisit their relationship, but Mortimer wants nothing to do with him. They spend the next 10 minutes singing about what might have been, and Mortimer begins to remember things. He ends up seducing and dominating the man in black, and they have sex on a bed while a group of children acrobats frolic about on long sheets of fabric above them. Just then, the puppet dressed in black shows up and orders the old man to go away. He explains to Mortimer that his punishment is to forever serve him, aiding in the future rape and murder of children in the village where he lives. As they both sing the title song, several children, including the little girl who drowned in Act 1, join in, all holding miniature puppets dressed in black. The new ending is a bit confusing, but apparently they're saying that pedophilia is some sort of vicious cycle. When a pedophile dies, his soul is placed in that of a newborn child, who will, by fate, be raped themselves. This influences them to become child molesters in their adulthood. Mortimer, as well as several other children, manage to defy destiny by escaping their respective rapist, which results in their being enlisted into the Puppetmaster's regime. Needless to say, it makes no sense, and is very creepy. Then, just like in the 1928 workshop, all of Mortimer's friends are returned to the puppet shop, but none of them have any memory of Mortimer. We cut back to the cart from the prologue, where we see that all the children have disappeared. From the back of the puppet box, Mortimer and the man in black exit from behind the curtains. They hop upon the horse and begin to trot their way out of town. As they exit the village, they hear a small girl's terrified screams, and she lunges out in front of the cart. She begins to beg Mortimer and the man to help her, just as an old man rushes out in pursuit. He insists he is the girl's father, but she sobs that she has never met him before. Panicked, Mortimer pulls on the horse's reins and runs over to the man, killing him. The man in black turns to Mortimer, his voice low, and whispers, "Mortimer, what have you done?" before the lights go out. However, right after this scene is where things quickly became wrong. The light slowly faded from the green tint of the forest into a deep blue, similar to the lighting during The Wind and the Whisperings. The entire company slips out from backstage, holding their miniature puppets, staring directly at the audience. Just then, lights began to flash, and the puppets. I know this sounds kind of stupid to say, but they sang. And I don't mean that the children sang while controlling the puppets' mouths. The puppets actually sang. And that song, it was the same gibberish from the Act 1 finale. The children, the adults, all of them were holding puppets. They chanted those horrible words over and over again. their eyes unblinking, focused on the audience. Trapped in our seats, we were forced to listen to the song repeat itself over and over. I saw that the cast had begun to move the puppets around in jerking, near erotic dance moves, every now and again twitching in unison with the rest of the company. After a while, I began to feel sick. We were all sick. I could see people in front of me leave their seats, ready to leave. I tried tuning out the chant. That only seemed to make them worse. Music pounded within me, causing me to jerk about with each pounding drum. As I leached back in my seat, I realized something. The pounding within me wasn't just from the orchestra. It was from beneath me. For a moment, I could see that everyone else could see it too. For a faint moment, we could feel the ground beneath us quake along with the chants. I looked up to see if the cast had noticed, but then I saw the puppets. They were still dancing and moving within the performers' grasp. But the performers themselves were not moving their arms. And then, for a moment, they all found relief. From backstage, several crew members rushed onto the stage, pushing several actors away in the process. One of them screamed out, "Fire! Shit!" And then the chaos began. From above the stage, all the lights began to shoot off. The projections behind the actors flickered briefly before shutting off entirely. The company screamed, as did the audience. In a flash of fire and sparks, the actors began to leap off the stage. We all began to pile out the door. I still had a headache. I could still hear the pounding. The fire department arrived shortly after the theater was evacuated. About 10 minutes before the trucks arrived, we heard the back of the theater collapse. I've since checked the articles online, and 60+ attendants of that show, 9 of them being the cast and crew, have gone missing. As it turned out, most of the people who didn't leave the parking lot were either helping out, like me, or were too shaken to drive. When I finally began walking towards my car, a gurney was wheeled right past me. The man I saw laying there, unconscious and hooked up to an oxygen tank, was the same man who handed me the playbill. I drove back to my friend's apartment and went straight to bed. Even in sleep, I could still hear the pounding. By morning, my headache had stopped, but the memory of the night before still lingered. I went to my computer straight away to upload the audio I had recorded. My camera tends to divide long videos into smaller ones, and I immediately deleted the last video. Nobody ever needed to hear that, especially not me. I listened through the recording again, making notes in word processor as I went along. I found myself humming to some of the more bouncy tunes. The pounding slowly faded away. My fear of the show had lessened. The idea of supernatural forces destroying the theater seemed far too ridiculous for me to take seriously, and I brushed my fear aside. Once that was done, I went to work scanning the playbill. After scanning the front, I went to work scanning the interior pages. A bit curious, I skimmed through some of the production names. And it was then, right there on the third page, I saw the picture of the man who handed me the playbill. The man was the head producer / director, I learned. A cheery old man with a wrinkled face, looking away from the camera. Below his picture, in bold letters, read the name: Timothy Cartwright. My face scrunched. My breath went still. All I could hear was the faint memory of the pounding. That isn't right, I told myself. It isn't possible. It's a different person. It had to be. Timmy Wright died on October 1st, 1935, at the premiere of the Puppetmaster's regime. Everyone saw it. Everyone saw him begging for help, strung up on strings. This isn't possible. Then I remembered something. In my interview with Alice Corley James, she mentioned Mortimer's squinty eyes and his monotonous acting. Timmy Wright was known for his wide-eyed expression and over-the-top delivery. It's what made him famous. The person performing Mortimer that night in 1934 must have been Rory Adkins, the understudy. That and Garris Creeley had been found dead, killed by a gunshot to the head. Everyone assumed it was suicide. Nobody even suspected murder. I remembered Devon's journal, the puppet mask, the clothes, the fascination Garris Creeley had with little cutie Wright. Nobody even suspected murder. Why would they? And then, to add to my revelation, I realized that among the cast members who had escaped from the theater, there was one boy sitting in the back seat of his mother's car. The vague, empty face of Milton Holiday. Mortimer. The Puppetmaster's regime is not a simple musical, I've come to realize. It's more than just a production. It's a force. An entity, even. It's not just a madman's sick, elaborate scheme to rape his own son. It isn't just a young boy's obsession over destroying his father's work. It isn't only an innocent victim's last attempt at showing the world how he was wronged. It's a greater monster than that. Within the writing and music of the show is something. I don't know what, and I don't want to know what. Some kind of monster that refuses to die. People who saw the Puppetmaster's regime both in 1928 and 1934 were said to have suffered from lifelong mental effects, causing them to hum tunes they had only heard once. Even now as I type, I quietly hum the sick, demented tune of Never Mind Me, Mister, when I sleep. The wind and whisperings refuses to rid itself from my subconscious. I find myself thinking about this production night and day, singing and thinking about possible depths to certain subplots and songs. What's worse is that I know that someday another revival of the demented work will make its way onto the stage. Milton Holiday is still alive, isn't he? And this evil won't rest until it remakes itself again. I've decided not to post any more of my findings. This includes the audio taken of Revival, and I suggest that none of you attempt to look further into the matter. It simply isn't worth it. Update. September 20th. I was able to find some articles about the fire at the theater. Those 60+ missing people. The fire department has been searching through the rubble. None of the bodies have been found.